a frozen island, vast, quiet, remote, and suddenly at the center of a global power struggle. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and today, Greenland is no longer just ice and geography. It is a test of common sense, of sovereignty, and of the world order itself. When the White House says that the US military is always an option, it is not just talking about Greenland. It is sending a signal about how power may be used in the 21st century. Europe hears that signal clearly. So does Denmark. So do smaller nations like Ireland, warning that common sense must prevail. Because if borders become negotiable again, if sovereignty becomes conditional, then no alliance, not even NATO, is truly safe. If this question unsettles you, it should. And if you value a world governed by rules rather than raw power, stay with me. Because to understand why Greenland matters now, we first need to understand what this moment is really about. At first glance, this may sound like political theater. A bold statement, a provocative headline, another flashpoint in an already tense world. But this is not about a single island. And it is not really about buying land. This is about how power is exercised and justified today. Greenland is legally and politically clear. It is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. It has self-government, its own parliament, and a people whose future is not a bargaining chip. Yet when a superpower frames territorial acquisition as a security necessity, the logic changes. Security becomes elastic, options expand, and norms begin to bend. European leaders understand this instinctively. That is why they rallied behind Denmark, not out of symbolism but out of self-preservation. Because if sovereignty can be overridden by strategic convenience, then the international system stops being a system. It becomes a contest, and contests have rules until they don't. To see how we arrived at this moment, we have to step back and look at the deeper historical and geopolitical forces shaping the Arctic today. To understand why Greenland has returned to the center of global attention, we have to look beyond headlines and into history. For decades, the Arctic was frozen not just in ice, but in relevance. It was peripheral, strategic, yes, but stable. The United States already had a military presence in Greenland, a base, an agreement, a quiet understanding with Denmark. That balance worked because the world itself was stable. Alliances were clear, rules were respected, power was restrained by institutions. But history moves in cycles, and we are entering a different one. The Arctic is no longer distant. It is central to security, to influence, to global competition. As ice melts, geography changes, routes open, strategic calculations shift, and when geography shifts, power follows. This is where old assumptions break down. What once could be managed through dialogue now gets reframed as urgency. And urgency in geopolitics is dangerous. Because when leaders convince themselves that something is necessary, they begin to believe that rules are optional. That is the deeper context behind today's statements. Not sudden aggression, but a gradual erosion of restraint. And once restraint weakens, crises rarely announce themselves in advance. Then came the moment when quiet calculations turned into a public shock. When the White House stated that the US military is always an option, a line was crossed, not legally, but psychologically. Because until that moment, Greenland had been discussed in abstractions: security interests, strategic presence, diplomatic engagement. This was different. This was force spoken aloud. Within hours, Europe reacted not with panic but with unity. Denmark pushed back, European leaders closed ranks, and Ireland's Prime Minister chose his words carefully but firmly. Common sense must prevail. That phrase matters because it signals something deeper than disagreement. It signals fear, not of invasion, but of precedent. If military power becomes a legitimate bargaining tool between allies, then alliances stop being anchors. they become risks. And suddenly, NATO's core promise, collective security, feels fragile. This was not a crisis of tanks or troops. It was a crisis of trust. And trust, once shaken, is hard to restore. If you're trying to make sense of why leaders reacted so quickly, why statements sounded unusually blunt, remember this moment. Because what followed was not about Greenland alone. It was about what kind of world we are sliding into next. What sits beneath all of this is a mechanism most people never see but always feel. Power does not disappear. It changes how it explains itself. In the past, influence was exercised through institutions. Bases were negotiated, allies consulted, boundaries respected even when inconvenient. Now, the language is different. Security is framed as absolute. Options are kept deliberately vague, and ambiguity becomes leverage. This is the hidden mechanism at work. When a superpower says something is essential to its security, every alternative suddenly looks secondary. Diplomacy becomes conditional. Law becomes flexible. And allies are forced into an uncomfortable position. Agree or be seen as obstructing security. That is why European leaders emphasize sovereignty and territorial integrity. Not to provoke Washington, but to anchor the conversation back to rules. Because once rules give way to necessity, there is no logical endpoint. Today it is Greenland. Tomorrow it is somewhere else. This is not about intent. It is about structure. Systems behave according to incentives. And the incentive right now is clear. Test how far power can go without consequence. History shows us what happens next. Not immediately, but inevitably, and that realization sets the stage for the next escalation. One that no one openly wants, but few know how to prevent. And this is where the tension tightens. Because even as officials insist there will be no invasion, the damage is already done. Words matter in geopolitics. And once the idea of force is introduced, it cannot be unheard. NATO now faces a contradiction it was never designed to handle. What happens when the perceived threat comes from within the alliance? Denmark hears a warning. Greenland hears uncertainty. Smaller states hear vulnerability. And Europe reacts not emotionally but strategically. A joint statement follows. Clear, coordinated, unambiguous. Greenland belongs to its people. Only Denmark and Greenland can decide their relationship. Security in the Arctic must be collective, not imposed. This is escalation without weapons. Pressure without movement. A standoff of principles. At the same time, the United Nations hovers in the background, invoked but weakened. Its authority referenced precisely because it is no longer guaranteed. That is the second crisis. Not a military clash, but a collision between power and legitimacy. When legitimacy erodes, force does not need to be used. The mere possibility reshapes behavior. And once that line is crossed, even reassurance sounds uncertain. The question is no longer what the United States intends. It is what the system now allows. And that question lands hardest on the people with the least power to answer it. Now, let me bring this closer to you. Because behind every statement, every alliance, every principle, there are people who live with the consequences. If you are Greenlandic, this is not an abstract debate. It is your land, your future, your right to decide who you are. And if you are European or from any small nation, you hear something else in this story. You hear the quiet question no one wants to ask out loud. If rules fail here, will they protect me tomorrow? This is why Michel Martin's words matter. Common sense must prevail, not ideology, not ego, not raw power. Common sense is the last defense of the small against the strong. It is what turns alliances into shields, not hierarchies. And when leaders speak of sovereignty and territorial integrity, they are not quoting legal text. They are speaking to people like you who depend on those principles without ever voting on them. If this story resonates with you, pause for a moment, reflect, and share it, because public attention is often the only pressure that still works. And as we widen the lens, you'll see why what's happening around Greenland is already rippling far beyond the Arctic, reshaping global politics in ways few fully grasp yet. When issues like this move beyond one country, they begin to alter the behavior of the entire system. Greenland may be geographically remote, but politically it sits at the crossroads of global power. What happens here is being watched quietly in capitals around the world. In Asia, leaders study how alliances hold under pressure. In Eastern Europe, states measure how seriously sovereignty is defended. In the global South, governments ask whether international law still constrains the powerful or merely advises them. This is how global norms weaken, not through collapse, but through selective application. If security can justify territorial ambition in the Arctic, why not elsewhere? That is why European leaders frame their response so carefully. They emphasize NATO, they invoked the UN Charter. They spoke of borders as inviolable, not to lecture the United States, but to signal to the world that rules still matter. Because once a single exception is tolerated, others follow. And when norms fragment, instability spreads. Alliances become transactional. Trust becomes temporary. Greenland, in that sense, is no longer a place. It is a signal that tells us whether the international order can still hold, or whether we are entering an era where power decides first and justification comes later. And that brings us to the most difficult question of all. What happens next? Looking ahead, there are only three plausible paths, and none are abstract. The first is restraint. Dialogue holds. Washington steps back from ambiguity. Security concerns are addressed through NATO, not around it. Greenland's status remains untouched, and trust slowly repairs itself. This is the best outcome. Not because it is ideal, but because it preserves the system. The second is drift. No invasion, no purchase, just continued pressure, statements that keep options open. Allies adjust quietly. Norms weaken without collapsing. The world becomes more cautious, more transactional, less trusting. This is the most likely scenario. The third is rupture. Not necessarily in Greenland, but somewhere else. A moment when precedent matters. When a powerful state points back and says this was allowed before. That is how systems break, not in one place, but across many. None of these futures depend on ice or territory. They depend on choices. Because geopolitics is not fate. It is behavior repeated. And the lesson of Greenland is simple but uncomfortable. When power tests limits and meets no resistance, those limits move. The question is not which path is possible. It is which one leaders and societies are willing to defend. And that brings us to the final insight. This moment will not be remembered for what happened in Greenland. It will be remembered for what didn't happen and why. Because the real story here is not about territory. It is about restraint. When leaders choose dialogue over dominance, they are not being weak. They are preserving a system that protects everyone, especially those without power. Michael Martin was right to invoke common sense. Not as a slogan, but as a warning. A world where borders are questioned, where military options are spoken casually, is not a safer world. It is a smaller one, more fearful, more brittle. Greenland exposed a fault line in the global order, between rules and raw power, between alliances and ambition. What happens next depends on whether societies like yours stay attentive. Because pressure does not only come from governments, it comes from citizens who refuse to normalize the unacceptable. If this analysis helped you see the world more clearly, share it. Continue the conversation and stay with me. Because this is not the last test of the international system. It is only one of the first, And in the videos ahead, we will examine where the next fault line is already forming.